All right, it's election day in the USA and Americans are casting their ballots for president and members of Congress. 100 million ballots were cast even before election day. Donald Trump is seeking to avoid becoming the first incumbent president to lose a re-election fight since George Bush Sr. in 1992. National polls show Democratic candidate Joe Biden with a broad lead, but the race is close in some key battleground states needed to win the presidency. Record early voting has been fueled by the coronavirus pandemic, and the US is on course for its highest electoral turnout in more than a century. The election comes after America's worst ever week for new coronavirus cases, and speculation that the way Trump has handled the pandemic will cost him this election. Well, let's take you live to New York now, joined there by our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, thank you for being with us. Just tell us what you've seen thus far, morning your time in New York.
Yeah, 9 degrees is the high here in New York on election day, but don't forget, 100 million people, Francis, have already voted. We are outside one of the largest polling stations in Manhattan in New York City, and I can tell you there's a trickle of voters here. Not the scenes we have seen in terms of the early voting, but I think indicative of the number we have just referenced of 100 million. Aaron's just going to tilt to his left to show you the entrance here, and there are no queues. Certainly a different day here in New York compared to the early voting scenes we saw at this very precinct where lines went around the corner. I'm told by precinct officials that some 200,000 people have already voted here. And remember, this is a polling station, like many in the city, that will remain open until 9 p.m. tonight. So 12 hours really for people to vote on this, which is election day, but also the final day of voting that has seen these records and speculation, Francis, that records set in 1908 will tumble when the final tallies are made around this country. A big push here from the Trump campaign in terms of the national turnout. Remember, he has been the one casting aspersions on absentee ballots and mail-in ballots, and so he's expecting a big turnout from his supporters around the country. But what we are hearing from some of our colleagues in some of the traditional red states, places like West Virginia, they are also seeing low turnout at polling stations, which could be indicative of not good news for the Trump campaign, because from early voting tabulations, Democrats have turned out more in terms of getting in their ballots in early. So Trump is expecting a big surge on the last 24 hours here, and that remains to be seen.
Already contestation expected from a US election night. Tell us what happens later in the day. As those polls close, maybe Trump might declare early, maybe not. Could this really be hot from the beginning, Sherwin?
So it depends on which state you are. So a state like Florida, for example, will receive mail-in ballots, and they can start counting those ballots before the polls close tonight. The difference is in a state like Pennsylvania, they are only allowed to start opening mail-in ballots on the day that are on today when polls open. And so that is the big concern, where you've had over 2 million mail-in ballots in that state. The concern is that it's going to take time opening up all those envelopes, getting them ready to be processed, and then having to count them and divide the vote, as it were. That is going to take time. So the speculation here is that Pennsylvania, which is one of those key swing states that we've been talking about regularly, Francis, could be delayed in determining the result. But it might not matter. Why? Because Florida closes at 7 p.m. It's going to be one of the first states reporting. Places like Georgia on the East Coast, North Carolina on the East Coast, if those go red or blue, one immediately starts getting an indication about how this election can go. I'll tell you this, if Biden wins Florida, if Biden wins Georgia, and if Biden wins North Carolina, that's an early indication of how this election is going to go. Of course, it would be true of Donald Trump winning those states as well. You'll get an early indication. So as much as we are speculating that we might not have a result by election night, that might not actually be the case. We could get an early indication from Florida. And remember, if Florida is lost to Donald Trump, his path to 270 electoral college votes seems almost impossible. So a big night for him, certainly. And remember, as I've indicated, Francis, a lot of people have voted already. It favors Democrats in terms of large turnout. Trump has some track to make up in this final day of voting. Let's see if he can get his supporters to the polls today.
And Sherwin, we've been talking about sort of going into this election. The US is extremely divided, but a lot of the global media focusing on the possibility of violence, the possibility of businesses being looted. How tangible is that for you today? Is this inevitable?
Look, it's not something that we haven't, in the near distant past. It's something that we've experienced. I mean, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, I think there's just a heightened sense of concern in terms of what could happen if things were to go awry. Remember, this is a president that has continued to cast aspersions on the integrity of this election. This is a president that tweeted last night that he could, that the Supreme Court ruling that places like North Carolina and Pennsylvania that can receive ballots 3 or 4 days after election day, the president is saying that this is going to could lead to violence on the streets. The head of state, the commander-in-chief, talking about how counting legitimate ballots, as they have done in the past, is going to cause violence on the streets. So there is a great deal of concern. If you look around Manhattan, where I am, you see some shop windows boarded up. This is a similar scene in places like Washington, D.C., in Los Angeles, in Chicago, around the country. I interviewed one of the voters earlier today who told me that he doesn't recognize the United States because of the threats of post-election violence, the boarded up businesses. It just doesn't feel like America anymore. And so that's why he came out to vote. So there is that concern. I also spoke to another voter who said he doesn't think it's going to go, that way because, Florida is going to go Biden, Georgia is going to go Biden, and that could really settle fears in terms of the gap which Biden will be able to maintain on election night, the gap that he has held in the polls and that edge in the swing states. So as much as there's a great deal of concern, I think authorities are ready for a worst-case scenario. We might not see that, Francis, but, famous last words.
All right, Sherwin, thank you so much. And we will check in with you again just after 8. Join us. We'll have a full panel discussion live from New York, from Washington. And we'll also look at the implications of this election for Africa and South Africa, specifically with our foreign editor. Thank you very much, SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease.